Alright, so after my last video about the settings that I use for mastering the Canon M50, it got me thinking about I've never really made a video about the basics of what the settings actually do. I mean, I talk about ISO, shutter speed, aperture, white balance, but I've never really explained what the different things do, how they affect your footage. So I'm actually going to create a series here about the basic setting. And today we're going to talk about aperture, ISO, shutter speed, what they do to your footage, when to change them, and when not to change them. Now, first of all, each one of these settings adjusts exposure. And that is, each one of the settings affects brightness. But as you adjust those settings, it's going to affect your footage and put different artifacts into your footage. So what you need to know is when to use what settings to get the effect that you want. We're trying to invoke emotion, we're trying to invoke feeling, we're trying to concisely bring our audience through a story, and you use the different settings in a different way in order to do that. So first of all, let's talk about shutter speed. Shutter speed is going to affect the motion blur of your video. And if you don't know what motion blur is, put your hand in front of your face and kind of wave it back and forth. And you'll see that it doesn't look perfectly sharp all the time. There's some motion blur to your hand, and this is what the shutter speed is going to affect in camera. I'm sure you've heard it from me and probably on other channels that you want to double your frame rate with your shutter speed because that's the most cinematic. And the main purpose for that is that it comes very close to what the eye sees. So doing a 1/50th of a shutter for 24 frames a second, 1/60th for 30 frames a second, and 1/25 for 60 frames a second gives you the most natural motion blur for that frame rate. But lowering your frame rate and raising your frame rate will actually add a different look to your footage, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So you see, overcranking your shutter like I am now adds a more jittery and fast-paced feel to your video. If you watch someone like Cody Wano, he's trying to do a really fast-paced type of a video, and so he almost always overcranks his shutter speed and has very little motion blur in his video. So if you're a high-energy person and you want to present high-energy information, overcranking your shutter speed will help you give that high-intensity, fast-paced feel to your video. And lowering your shutter speed gives this feeling of disorientation. It's pretty dizzying just to watch. So if you want your character, they just fell down and you want them to feel disoriented, then lowering your shutter speed, this camera can actually go down to 1/8 of a second, will give you more of this disorienting feeling where nothing's in focus and you can't focus on anything. But if you're just doing normal content like I do in these videos and the rest of this video, doubling your frame rate with your shutter speed is the best option because it matches what your eye sees and it doesn't get distracted. So using faster shutter speeds and slower shutter speeds are a good storytelling tool if you know how to use them. But if you don't want your audience to be distracted with how the video looks and you're trying to convey information like I am now, then what you want to do is you want to double your frame rate with your shutter speed, and that is going to give you the most natural motion blur and isn't going to distract your audience. ISO, you probably just saw the result of a high ISO. You get a lot of noise in your shot, and so keeping your ISO lower is going to help you have clean images. And usually I tell people to keep their ISO down. Well, actually one of you told me in a comment to my last video that the highest dynamic range that the M50 gets is at ISO 200. And so that helps save your highlights and give you a little bit more information in your highlights. So higher you raise your ISO, more noise you're going to have. Lower you lower your ISO, less noise you're going to have, but the most dynamic range, if you can keep your ISO at it, is 200. I would probably not go above 1600 ISO with this camera just because it gets really noisy, and that noise is going to be most prominent in areas with a lot of shadows. And so just keep that in mind when you're raising your ISO, and don't raise it up too much or else you're going to have footage that's pretty much unusable. And the last setting that I want to talk about today is your aperture. Now, aperture is one of the most important things in your video. I usually shoot at wide apertures, and you probably heard all over the place that wide apertures are more cinematic. Wide apertures are more pro. And I think it's important to know why that's said. Now, the wider the aperture, the more shallow depth of field you're gonna have. That's why people like shooting at f2.8 or f1.8, 1.4, 1.2, down to 0.95. And the reason that you use shallow depth of field is separation from your background. It has nothing to do with being more pro. It has to do with bringing your audience's attention where you want it. And if you think about it, hold your hand up in front of your face. Now look at your hand and then look at the background far off in the distance. And you'll see that one of the two is not going to be in focus. And that's basically what a wider aperture is mimicking. And you can use this as a storytelling technique. When you see in a movie where the focus lacks from one face to the other because that's where the filmmaker wants you to focus. And so using a shallow depth of field without much in focus allows you to bring your audience's attention wherever you want it because your eye is automatically drawn to the sharpest thing in the video. Well, that's it for this video. If you found this helpful, go ahead and give me a like, comment down below with any questions you have, subscribe to the channel for more content. We're going to be doing a series on camera basics specifically tailored to the M50, but it's not just going to apply to the M50, it's going to apply to pretty much every camera that you use. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.